actually a letter that Washington sent, but this kind of sums it up. We're going to look at that later. Can everybody read that okay? Does anybody need it read to them because they can't see it? I'll give you a little bit of a moment to read that. About the 80,000 bushels of grain that were destroyed in 1780 by Johnson. Good? Okay, we're going to explore that a lot. Okay, my wife always tells me when I write like Michener. I start with the Ice Age and go forward. Guess what? That's where we're going to start today, too. I just want to go over very quickly why the Schoharie Valley was a great grain producing area. So as you're looking out over the flats, this is overlooking Broman's Nose, Broman's Land at the time. The reason why the soil is so good for grain in this valley is because of the glacier. The last glacier that advanced and retreated multiple times, and evenally it left a lake here that when it dissipated, that all the organic debris that was ground up by the glaciers as they advanced was deposited on the soil. So you have soil that is feet deep with alluvial soil, very loamy, even to the point of being clay in a lot of areas. So that is the reason why, and of course that glacier would have scraped the top of what is Broman's Nose. That's how, or actually way above it, the lake would have scraped a shoreline on top of Broman's Nose where the dance floor is. Now, the flats here in Schoharie, again, overlooking Broman's Nose. Broman's Nose and points south are actually sandstone. Points north from Middleburg north is limestone. So this isn't even the best grain growing area. It's great for other crops, but for grain, especially wheat, the sandstone subsoils aren't as good as limestone subsoils. So with proper manuring and other management, this can be very productive, but it's not even the best stuff. And that's why the Palatines chose the area where they were from what is now Middleburg north, because it fit the limestone subsoils that they were looking for. They didn't care about this land. You can read that in my book, Schoharie series. So what was this land really good for? Well, originally it's corn. Three sisters, the Haudenosaunee Three Sisters, squash, beans, and corn. But of course, with the colonists, it's wheat. Winter wheat, planted in fall, lies dormant through the winter vernalization process. It's just there's got to be a certain temperature that it needs in order to lie dormant and still germinate underneath the surface. Harvested in the late spring and early summer. Hardier and generally higher crop yields. So the winter wheat, being under the ground longer, actually produces higher crop yields. And it's also a little bit hardier, sturdier. Spring wheat, planted in the spring, harvested in late summer, early fall, generally lighter and lower crop yields. What that means is that when the summer wheat starts being harvested in late July, August, you usually get a little bit less, but it's also a little bit lighter, which comes into play. And just something about this, how you know when it is, there's actually a story here in Broman's Land, actually, during the attack on August 9, 1708 by Joseph Brand on Broman's and point south to what is now Blenheim. And what they talked about was the summer wheat that they were then harvesting in late July and into August. So that's how you know it kind of correlates, right? Okay, the importance of bread. Soldiers' basic daily ration is 1 pound of beef and 1 pound of bread. What happens if soldiers don't get fed? Well, this is what happens. The late scarcity of flour, during which time part of the troops were 7 days without bread, and one of the brigades on the verge of a mutiny, has had such an effect on the corps commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Pauling, that 2/3 of the corps have deserted within a few days past. This is December of 1779. This is the commanding officer of the Highlands Department, which would include include West Point and points around that. They were going through a drought at that time, but we'll get into that in a little bit. So they're mutinying, they're leaving because they're not getting fed. You're going to see a lot of quotes. It's going to be a little dry. I'll do a tap dance if I can, make it more entertaining. But these are the kinds of things that, even before we talk about what Schoharie lost in the Johnson raid, what it means for the breadbasket of the revolution, things were not good. This is all from New York. I'm doing all in my power to lay up magazines for summer, but think it will be out of my power to lay up such supplies as to bring, I think there's a missing word there, harvest, unless the legislature will make some provision for seizing the new crop. And then immediately, as the Tories and those worse than the Tories, the jobbers, are hiding their flour in barns, outhouses, and in the woods until they can get it over the state line. They will call it new wheat to prevent my seizing it, which makes the business go on very heavy. We'll get into the laws. Here's another one. I have reason to believe from good information that several persons in Tryon County and some at Schoharie are still possessed of some new wheat and who are endeavoring to hold it privately after all their application. They are in expectation, I understand, to sell for hard money. Hard money is scarce at this time. And we're going to get into pricing and all kinds of fun stuff. This is a commissary who's one of the agents who are trying to procure wheat and other supplies for the army. This one's interesting. Confiscation of the flour, etc., will never restrain the wicked for the violation of laws so important in their nature. A soldier receives 39 lashes for absenting himself without leave, and yet a citizen not better born than him shall pass without any corporal punishment, although he shall do his utmost to starve that very soldier. Now, these are examples. They're not the only thing that exists out there for correspondence. These are just one picked out of many that explain the importance of flour and wheat. So this is very simple. 1 bushel of wheat or flour, 60 pounds. 1 barrel of wheat or flour, 196 pounds. 10 barrels per ton. These are going to come into play later. Now, when we talk about the 80,000 bushels of wheat, it's at a specific time. That's why we can look at 1780 and kind of make reasonable judgments about what that means. But the problem here is when you talk about a breadbasket, New York itself was under a lot of stress and pressure right from 1776, starting in New York, but mostly what we call upstate now, 1777. The Burgoyne campaign put almost everybody under arms. All the men, they're either heading north or they're having difficulties like the Flocky, if you were here for that talk by Mark. Other things are happening locally that prevent harvesting, or for that matter, planting the next crop, a winter wheat, if you're in summer. So 1777 Burgoyne campaign, 1778 the attacks on the frontier, Cobleskill, German Flats, which is now around Utica, Cherry Valley. These are all fine grain districts. Summer drought. In 1779, lower crop yield of winter wheat. That's where you get most of it, right? Late year drought. That's gonna harm your next crop of winter wheat. 1780, very early. There's because of the drought that was there at the end of 1779, it continues into 1780. Dry streams preventing grinding of wheat into flour. That's a problem. That's a problem. You can't be out there with a mortar and pestle and get as much as you need for the army. We're going to look at a lot of that logistical thing. Now, what this sets up is what the quotas that each state was supposed to provide the army for flour. Pennsylvania, 40,000 barrels at 196 pounds each, 130,677 bushels, okay? Maryland, 20,000 barrels, 65,333 bushels. North Carolina, 15,000 barrels, 49,000 bushels. Most of these areas had not at this point been the seat of war, at least in the grain districts anyway. Where's New York? Fourth. How much? 13,969 barrels, which is only 45,632 bushels. This is for the army. okay? Now you can see New Jersey and Virginia. This is for the Army. Public use is an interesting thing because the way it works is that Congress sets the quotas for each state. Now this isn't the only thing these states are supposed to provide. Other states will have rum, tobacco. Almost everybody provides short forage, which is for the livestock, and also the beasts of burden, horses, oxen. So there's a lot of things that are being sent to the Army that are under quotas. The Congress sets the quota. Then it's up to the state to raise that quota, but also what they think they need for their state troops, who are called levies, who are in the actual service for 3, 6, 9 months. If militia is called out to garrison a fort or go on an extended service, they need to be fed also. So they're trying to figure out what is needed. When we talk about the breadbasket of the revolution, that's the Army. The Army is what is the revolution. The people are behind it, but the Army is what matters. So they're looking at the Army for 45,632 bushels. I have seen what may be the total that each state was needed in order to do it. Pennsylvania was about 400,000 bushels. New York was only 160,000. Those are the highest end, okay? But the ratio is pretty much the same here. It's about, for New York, it's about 2.5 times less than Pennsylvania, no matter what you're talking about. So of course you're gonna ask, well, if New York has the quota so low, and it's not the highest, how can the breadbasket of the revolution be in that state? That's the fundamental question, right? It can't. It can't. If there's anything, oh, there's somebody else claiming to be the breadbasket of the revolution. This is the Delmarva Peninsula, Delaware and Eastern Shore region of Maryland and Virginia. This isn't the only place that claims breadbasket of the revolution. Chester County, Pennsylvania, there's others. All you got to do is look, and it's not that hard to find, actually. But when you talk about this particular peninsula, it's a very small area that's, you know, I'll say interconnected. 600,000 bushels of wheat per year. Not all of it's for the Army. It's also got to feed Philadelphia, Baltimore, and other places. So that's a whole other subject, is what's needed for civilian use, let alone for any Army, state troops, militia. So it becomes a lot of rabbit holes there, okay? So that's it. That's the talk. Schoharie Valley, Schoharie District was not the breadbasket of the revolution. Okay, thank you. Shortest talk I ever had. No.
Back to the sandstone and limestone, which is on which side of the valley?
Sandstone is south of Middleburg. Limestone is north of Middleburg.
That's the part that they wanted.
Palletized, correct. Correct. That was what interested them. Next. Now that that is said, now we can look at maybe why it's called the breadbasket of the revolution, but also now we got to figure out what part of the revolution the Schoharie District was part of. And I will assure you it's a better story than just saying breadbasket of the revolution. But let's look at breadbasket of the revolution as a term. Anybody ever do this on Google? Ngram? Let me explain what this means. Google Books digitized well over 20 million publications. Most of them books. A lot of them are, some kinds of periodicals, possibly magazines, random things like maybe 1 or 2 of the historical reviews around here. But the term breadbasket of the revolution, and this will go back as far back as when books were published. A lot of these are published later. I'll say like the Clinton papers that I use frequently in here. They were published around 1905 and going forward. So that's when it's going to show up, not backwards, okay? So let's take a look at this because this is really instructive. What it does is kind of give you an idea about when certain terms, people, events get into the popular culture. It's not everything. They haven't digitized everything, but they really do give you an idea when things really started getting into the popular culture. So let's look at this a little bit. 1700 all the way into the 1900s, flatline, nothing. Breadbasket of the Revolution is not a term. During the Revolution, breadbasket was definitely used. However, revolution was never used in the way we use it today to describe the revolution. They called it the War of 1776, or 76, or they called it, the War for Independence. They called it a lot of different things. Revolution they usually use as more of an adjective, like revolutions and convulsions, that kind of things. They never called it the revolution back then. So what does this mean, right? So it's a flat line into the 1900s. Well, the 20s, right about here, you start seeing a little bit of spike in the common use of the term breadbasket of the Revolution. That was the 150th anniversary of the Revolution. It wasn't celebrated as big as, say, the bicentennial, or the centennial, or the upcoming 220 or 250th. However, they did celebrate, they did have parades, and they did have some published materials. So that's where you see a little bit of spike about the use. People are trying to find a way to explain why their area is important, okay? 1940s, 1950s, World War II. People are looking back at the American Revolution, trying to make sense of it in a current, very large world war, okay? But also, coming out of that, post-war boom in the 50s especially, baby boomers, right? What's important about the 50s? That's when the average family had money they could take a vacation. People are trying to draw people to their sites. Happens here, by the way. It's the Yellowstone Fort book. You'll learn about that in the Yellowstone Fort book that I wrote. Okay? So that's when tourism really takes off for the first time, because most average people can now do it. Then what happens? Kind of takes a dip, goes up a little bit, but look at this, 1970 to 1980. What's that? Bicentennial, right. So this is where most people hear about things like Breadbasket of the Revolution or other terms that other areas use in order to draw attention to where they are at. Then it goes down, then what happens again in the early 2000s? 9/11, Iraq, now we head into Afghanistan, right? Wars that make you wonder about what did we do in the past? What can we learn from that? That's when these things come up. So what you're really looking at is most people who are alive today, except for the precious few that are older than 100 years old, they have heard this their entire lives around here about Breadbasket of the Revolution. You know what the one thing this doesn't show, though? Is all the periodicals, tourism, advertising, the county website, everything that calls Breadbasket of the Revolution, it doesn't include that, right? So this is what gets into more popular books and other things of that nature. Now you're going to say, well, no, they don't have anything from the 1700s. They don't have anything there. How can you tell me that they didn't say anything? Well, here is a little bit of a look at something that does. Benedict Arnold. Look at that. Way back then, he becomes really famous during the Revolution, right between 1750 and 1800. His treason, that's probably his high point, and he drops off again. Look at this. As people are looking at different things that happened, 1850 to about 1925, history books, a lot of them are written for the first time with primary sources. Documentary history of New York, the Clinton papers that I use, they're all being made between 1850 and 1925. Gateway to the West by Nelson Green, 1925. Roscoe Locally, 1883. It's all within that, okay? They're all talking about Benedict Arnold. And if you look at Google Books, you'll find those books, right? So there is your proof that, yes, there are books out there from the 18th century. None of them say anything about Breadbasket of the Revolution. And if you put in Schoharie Breadbasket of the Revolution, you won't get anything. That's because that's a specific phrase. Usually you don't go Schoharie Breadbasket of the Revolution. There's a comma or there's some kind of, Schoharie County is known as the Breadbasket of the Revolution, the beautiful valley of, so that's why it doesn't show up. You gotta put in all those different phrases in order to get what you want. So now we get to what's important about the Schoharie Valley. First, let's define what the Schoharie-Duanesburg district is. It's Albany County. Here, This is the dividing line between Albany and Tryon County, the 1772 division. So most of what we call Schoharie County is in Albany County at the time. It includes not only Cobleskill over here, this is where we are at with the lower fort or the Old Stone Fort, middle fort, upper fort up in here. Also includes Duanesburg up here, Beaver Dam over here, this very grain-rich area. So what was it like being out here during the Revolution? Right there. This picture tells 1,000 words, right? Maybe a million. One eye on the plow, one eye on the tree line. That's where the danger is going to come from. Whether it's the Indian Department, the Loyalists, or whether it's Joseph Brandt's men, they come out of the tree line. That's what you're looking at. So now, 1780, we have actual numbers, or at least something to work with. So we're going to focus in on that year and what it meant. Okay? Losses from Sir John Johnson's October 17, 1780 raid. 74 homes, this is just the Schoharie district, which is the Schoharie Valley, from about Middleburg up to what is now about Sloansville. 74 homes, 77 barns, 3 grist mills, 1 sawmill. Okay. The estimate of 80,000 bushels of public wheat, unknown livestock and outbuildings. Okay. So the 80,000 bushels is coming from Washington. You know, James Madison was aware, so it was a significant amount. It caught people's attention. That no doubt came from the governor of New York, George Clinton, who would have been closer to the ground. Okay. So the combined with the Mohawk Valley, 200 homes, 150,000 bushels of wheat, and a proportionate amount of other grains and forage. So Schoharie had 80,000 destroyed, or at least that's what they estimated. Then the Mohawk lost 70,000. Simple math, right? Let's get some perspective on this. The New World Dutch barns were fairly uniform in size and capacity. One study performed by the Dutch Barn Preservation Society found that an average Dutch barn had 36,150 cubic feet of crop space, or 325,350 pounds. If filled to capacity, half was used for storage of grain, or 162,675 pounds, at 9 pounds per cubic foot. At 60 pounds per bushel, the typical Dutch barn filled to capacity would hold 2,711 bushels of wheat. That's a lot. I'm never going to tell you that 80,000 is not a lot of grain. So let's look at this, revisit the Johnson rate, 80,000 bushels of wheat divided by 77 barns. That's 1,038 bushels per barn destroyed. 38% of a capacity of a Dutch barn. The study that they used actually required 271 acres at a crop yield of 10 bushels per acre in order to fill. The average farm size was about 150 acres out here. Some had larger farms, 450 or more. Some had 2 Dutch barns that can tell you, now you can look at that and say how much acreage they had, right? It makes sense. So that 38% capacity is actually more in line with a smaller acreage farm. So when you look at 150 versus that 38% capacity is actually very much in line with, not full, but it's a lot closer to what they would have. Okay, what's 80,000 bushels of wheat? $120,000 in specie. Now, specie is hard coin. It's a Spanish milled dollar. It was the most consistent coin as far as the price of silver out there. It's like our American dollar everywhere else, at least it has been. And that specie is $1.50 per bushel of wheat. That's what the cost is. It's always that throughout the Revolution. But because of depreciation by 1780, which things are being paid in paper money, not much backing it, which means in order to buy something that was $1 before the Revolution, now it's 77.5 times more paper money in order to buy that. So that wheat was actually $9,300,000. That's a lot. That's a lot. 80,000 bushels at 60 pounds per bushel, 4,800,000 pounds. Wow, right? That's a wow. What can it do? It can feed an army of 10,000 to be fed for 480 days. Wow, right? Just by itself. But let's look at the laws and what they mean. We're going to come back to all that. New York Legislature flour quota for public use, 1979. 1/8 of the old, 1/8 of the new. The old is generally the winter wheat that's been stored that has not been distributed in any way, but has been assessed. The 1/8 of the new is the summer wheat, because these are all made in, let's say, February of the year. So we're talking about the previous year, what's available. So now we have 1/8 of the new, 1/8 of the old. That's a quarter of your total production. And there's always provisions to seize flour or wheat that's transported out, that is captured while trying to stop people from bringing it over state line without a permit, or it's hidden from assessment, it's in the outhouses like the one letter was. So now we look at 1780, because this is very important. After allowing for 1 bushel of wheat or an equivalent in flour per head per month until the 1st of August next for each person and respective families within the state, empowering the assessors to seize the remainder and deliver over to the Commissary General of Purchases 2/3 parts thereof for the use of the Army, the other 1/3 part to be stored for relieving the future wants of the inhabitants. So this is February 21st, 1780. That's when the law is now into effect. This is the New York law. This is Washington's actual letter about it. A lot of people seem to remember that this letter says breadbasket of the revolution in it, when it really doesn't. The destruction of the grain upon the western frontier of the state of New York is likely to be attended with the most alarming consequences. In respect to the formation of magazines upon the North River, we had prospects of establishing a very considerable magazine of flour in that quarter previous to the late incursion. The settlement of Schoharie only would have delivered 80,000 bushels of grain, but that fine district is now destroyed. I should view this calamity with less concern did I see the least prospect of obtaining the necessary supplies of flour for the states of Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland, previous to the interruption of transportation by frost and bad roads. So what this grain would have done is, we'll back up a little bit. The first thing we have to ask is, was 80,000 bushels of grain an actual number, an estimated number, what they expected? I can tell you this, because of all the problems New York had with growing grain up to this point, up until the summer of 1780, all was gloom and doom. But once the summer harvest came in, which is not usually the one that's the big one, once that comes in, everybody was talking about how much it was the most in memory. It rivaled the pre-revolution numbers. And it wasn't just the people in the state. It was the Congress, it was Washington, but it was also the enemy. John Johnson used this as a reason why it should be attacked, is because reports were saying that the grain coming in was as much as anybody can remember. Okay? So everybody's talking about what to expect. So the destruction really deflates what's happening, and there's a reason why for that. If you look at where the different departments are of the Army, look at the concentration around New York. Okay? Northern Department, Albany North. That would also include the Mohawk Valley. Schoharie Valley would be part of that. Eastern Department, New England. Not a grain growing area at all. In fact, wheat from New York was expected to help Massachusetts, Rhode Island, especially with the French fleet there at this time. You can see we're just 45,000 is quite a bit. It would feed a lot of people, right? Well, think about this. The Highlands also, where we already saw they had issues feeding their men. They're deserting. And after this, it was even worse in the Highlands Department. West Point. Middle Department, that's George Washington's army. Wherever it happened to be, that's the Middle Department. Where is he? Right around New York City most of the time. Whether he's in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, or lower New York, it's all about New York City. Okay? Then you got the Southern Department. All right? So when you look at this stuff, and you see what was destroyed here just in the Schoharie and Mohawk valleys, the real story here isn't that it was the breadbasket of the Revolution. The real story is what these areas like along the Hudson that held the Hudson that was so important in the Revolution. Burgoyne came down to take the Hudson. Benedict Arnold turned traitor to give the Hudson to the British, right? This is the British war aim throughout the war. That's the focus. So what happens? You deprive the Highlands, where they are counting on wheat from this area, Mohawk Valley, Schoharie Valley, to not only provide wheat and breadstuffs for the Highlands Department, West Point and areas around that, but also the French Fleet, Eastern Department. So what happens? What was Washington talking about where he had the least confidence in that he could get wheat from Pennsylvania, which is the largest producer, by the way, Delaware and Maryland. What was his lamentation about that? It's because what happens is, if you take more from there, right, it's scarce, but you gotta get it from somewhere, so somehow you gotta get it from here. This is the real area, right here is the real area where that wheat is just so productive and so useful. If you've gotta bring it up from the south, what happens? What happens? Just when the Southern Department is taking off as far as the seat of the war, Nathaniel Greene being down there in 1780, 1781, what happens is there's less available for him. So what does he complain about throughout the entire war? No supplies, no money, no bread, nothing. And yet he still stitched together the effort that pushed Cornwallis into Virginia. With very little, but it made it so much harder. So what happens is, instead of having wheat coming from here, over here, you have wheat coming from here, up here, into these different departments that deprive the Southern Army of foodstuffs. And in the Southern Army, what happens is you've got the American Continentals, you've got the British under Cornwallis. They're never very large armies down in that area. But they're marching back and forth over the same area, so what they're doing is living off the land. There's nothing there. Things have to be shipped down. Okay? So we haven't talked about another very important part about wheat, and that is transportation. Good news is there was a source in 1780 that laid out exactly what the transportation rates were. $12 per ton per month. That's not specie. That's paper. Okay, 22 tons, and this is in the source. That's why I used a certain amounts. 22 tons equals approximately 733 bushels, or 224.5 barrels. Cost of transportation, $52,800. If it sounds like a lot, it is a lot, especially with money that's worthless, right? Cost of wheat, $65,970. $90 per bushel of paper currency. Total cost of transport, $118,770. Now when you look at the $12 per ton per mile, this is based on 200 miles, okay? What's not said in the source is whether it's 200 Teamsters taking it a mile, or 5 Teamsters taking it, whatever that is, okay? So that's this rate. Well, what happens when it's 1780 in October, trying to move something after the destruction of what's here in the Schoharie and Mohawk valleys? There is the same thing under the depreciation of the time. What's the total cost now? $138,011.25, at least in our terms. So it just keeps going up and up and up throughout the year. This is the worst time of the year to have destruction of your grain crops here in New York. Because now that cost, you have to transport overland much farther. It costs Congress more. And if you have a Congress that doesn't have enough money to begin with, money is becoming useless. They don't have hard specie. This is what straps the Congress. They cannot raise a revenue. The states do. And even then, anything the states give, it's all voluntary. So the states had to what? Tax the people. Anybody that says taxation has caused the revolution, no, it's taxation without representation. They've got representation now, but you're still going to be taxed.
Is it modern dollars or is that?
No, this is actual dollars at the time. The paper currency is $12. That's what they used at the time.
That was quite expensive.
Yep. But in specie, it's still $1 in what you would call it $1.50 in specie, hard coin, which you don't have, which would be wonderful to use. But that's why a lot of people hid around their wheat during the war to hide from the assessor. And here was Peter Snyder Jr., who was the assessor from 1779 on, probably the most hated person, right? Especially if he had seizure capability, not him, but the commissaries. So if you would go to a house or a farm, and he's got to be familiar with what acreage is, how much the crop may yield. So he's assessing it and going, okay, you only got 150 acres, but in reality, you probably got about a third of it being used at any given time. So you kind of go, ballpark, this is what your quota is. Okay? This is what you need for me. I'm going to buy it from you, but if you don't sell it to me with useless money, we're going to seize it. That's what 1780 was all about. Okay? So that's a really tough proposition. And what you can save is 1 bushel per head per month for each person in your family. Okay, so you start doing the math in your head. If you got a family of 5, it's only 5 bushels a month. And into August, and we don't even know about August, what is actually in effect. Because the law ends in August when you do that, where the family keeps only 1 bushel per head per family. So it's about 5 or 6 months. Well, what does it revert back to? Is it the 1/8 of old and new? Is it the seizure value? And that's really what gives us the 80,000 bushels. Is it 1/4 of the whole? Is it what could be seized? What was above each head of each head in a family? So these are a lot of rabbit holes that still need to be explored, but they're not so easily found. Okay? So in the end, when you add in the cost of the wheat, the destruction of wheat in an area that is depended on for everything points east, especially the Hudson River posts, West Point, Ticonderoga, right? The Mohawk Valley post, the Schoharie Valley posts, eastern, into New England, the French fleet. It's critical. It's critical. Not the breadbasket of the revolution, but you know what it really comes down to? That's what it really is. That's what it really was. Okay? This is what I mean by a better story. When you strip away the mythology and the assumption, because when you have a simple summary, I understand why it's there. It helps explain things in very few words. It's great for tourism. But when you strip away that, you get to the underlying layers that really tell you a much different story. The same thing is with Timothy Murphy. If you only go with Timothy Murphy, as important as he was in local history and family history and in this area, if you only talk about him, boy, do you really lose a whole big story beyond that with other people, other events, and different things. But this is really what the Schoharie Valley was. And you really can't extricate the Schoharie Valley from the Mohawk Valley or the Hudson Valley as far as wheat goes. It's all part of that economic engine that feeds the revolution and feeds important, very critical posts. And not only that, but because New England isn't a grain-growing country, It really does help the civilian population out there, and if you look at the correspondence, you see it constantly. We caught somebody, you know, trying to transport over the line to Connecticut, to Massachusetts, stuff from Rhode Island. They're constantly asking for permits to bring hundreds of barrels of flour into New England. That's what New York had to stop in order to have something for the Army in the Highlands and in that area. Because one thing New York did, by the way, and this is how I'm going to close it, one thing New York did, beyond the other ones, is they tried to do more. Governor Clinton was somebody who, if they're given a quota and they can't meet it because all these other things are happening, he did everything in his power to make it happen. So he was a force, and Washington literally sends him letters because it says, and I'm paraphrasing, we know that you will do your utmost to do what we need, food, okay? It all comes down to food. Remember, it was Napoleon that said, an army marches on its stomach, right? And it's so true here. You don't get fed, and then you add in all the other things that the average soldier had to deal with, clothing that they didn't get, cold weather, isolation. Even though states have quotas, they don't always meet them. In fact, they rarely do. And yet, they persisted through the revolution. It's an amazing thing to think about, right? But it did cause mutinies in 1781, Pennsylvania line. That was mostly about pay, but it was also about food and clothing and everything else that they were owed, that they never got, okay? So, a little different story, but I think, to me, it's a better story. Because you can actually see the importance of the wheat out here in real terms, money, transportation, all the things that a lot of historians overlook because it's not as fun as a bloody battle. You go, look what they did to this poor guy. Cannonball hitting somebody's head. Ooh, that's cool. This stuff is what really fed the revolution. The other stuff happened. This stuff was necessary because everybody needs food, right? So that is the presentation. Any questions? Yes.
So, in the report of the assessor, as to how much grain to be expected from the farm,
Yep.
is there an indication that his assessments would change at Middleburg, north at
No.
Middleburg, south?
No.
Did they not know
No.
that there was less?
It doesn't matter. It's whatever your acreage could yield, that's what he's after.
Was it?
That's what his job is.
Was
So
there less yield?
if somebody in Schoharie, if somebody right here had a farm of 150 acres and they could have, let's say, 1,000 bushels, right? That's what he assesses it at. That's what it is. So if a farm down there has 995, that's what they get assessed at. It's not uniform, it's what you are producing or what your acreage and crop yield is gonna be.
Did they produce as
Yes.
much down there?
What's that?
Did they produce as much grain down there as here?
There's gonna be variations. I don't wanna give the idea that it's, hundreds of thousands of bushels up here and nothing down there. It's not the way it works. It's like small percentages. If they manage it properly down there, they can get the same type of yields, but it just takes a little bit more work. Yep. Any other questions? Yes.
At the same time, were they paying their rent to the landlord? It's winter wheat, right?
It depends on what it is. Remember, is it that? How many renters were out here? You have an answer?
Well, down in Livingston,
Yeah.
Dwaynesburg did.
That's exactly it. In those areas, you do have renters where they do have to give not just winter wheat, but usually it's the increase, because it's the old patroonship system, the increase of livestock that they are provided to be there. So any new cattle that's born, it belongs to the landlord. That's the way it works. I'm not sure how that was assessed, but it would be assessed in some degree about what is available in order to do. So a renter would have a different situation, but somewhere in that fold, he's still gonna be assessed. Whether it's the landlord being assessed for all of the estates that are on there, it might have gone that way. But I don't know for sure. I don't know for sure. I've never looked at that, you know, to say, yep, that's the way it was. But you can see the rabbit holes that are opened up when you start thinking more about, you know, those terms. Instead of a breadbasket, it's, what does that mean? You know, 80,000 bushels, okay, how much does it take to transport? Who's the assessor? How do they do it? A lot of rabbit holes there that aren't readily available. Any other questions?
I was just gonna ask you that question. What do we know about the management of this system? How effective was it?
Yeah.
One thing to assess, it's another thing to actually
Yeah.
bring in
Yeah.
the full amount. And then how is that then transferred logistically?
Yeah. Well, this is the problem. This is why you have to have people that you have trust with in order to do these things. Because corruption was rampant. Rampant. You can imagine the assessor going around to each farm and a farmer going, hey, here's a little something for you, right? I don't want to be assessed. If I can produce 2,000 bushels, how about if you just say there's 1,000? Usually that type of person is going to be selling it for someone with hard money. You know who has hard money? The enemy. Brandt's coming through. If he doesn't have specie, he'll give him an IOU, but it's not for paper currency. It's, next time I come through, I'm going to have some money for you, real money. But corruption was everywhere. So there's constant complaints about this commissary, that commissary. Udney Hay was the one that was dealing with this mostly, but there were other ones. You really had to have trust with these people, because in the colonial period, one of the things that's there is when you have our commissioner or you are a commissary, you are allowed a certain percentage of what you're purchasing. So if you're purchasing this much, and you only claim this much, guess what that is? Grift, right? Corruption. That was rampant throughout. I'm not just talking about New York, it's every state. And that's what made it so difficult to understand. 80,000, is it something that was a hard number, or was it something that somebody made up? You know, to say, hey, you know, we kind of expected 80,000, but is it? Was it 65,000? I don't know, right? But the corruption was everywhere, and that's what makes any definitive statement about if there's 80,000 bushels of grain, how much of it actually gets somewhere, right? Let's just say it grew, we didn't have the Johnson rate. It grew. How much of that actually went? Was it 70,000? Were people culling some of it out for themselves at the top levels? Were the Teamsters, were they hiding a barrel out of every wagon? Which I think is about 6 or 7 barrels per wagon, the way it works out. So are they taking a barrel from themselves, selling it on the side? Holy cow, right? Holy cow. What an opportunity to waste. And that was throughout, not just here, not just with food, it was for everything, clothing. And that's why it was so hard to feed the Army and provide for the Army, is because of a lot of corruption. It's a wartime. There's money being spent, might not be hard money, but you're still gonna make something on the side. That's what everybody tries to do. That's where the term jobber comes from. That's the jobber, the grifter. Yeah.
What were the routes used to distribute grain from this area, and by what means was that grain distributed?
Well, remember, $12 per ton per mile. That's overland, which is almost everything, because the United States did not control the seacoast, so almost everything went overland. When you could, you put it on the water. It's quicker. Quicker means cheaper, right? Even if the rate is the same, it's quicker, so it's cheaper. But think about this. That grain that comes from that Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, if it's got to go north, now you're talking several hundred miles for one teamster, let alone many. And how do you get around the British Army and where it is, right? and all its allies. You gotta worry about loyalists, highwaymen, right? And then you gotta worry about the British Army wherever you're going. So you probably can't take direct routes, like the post roads that are around the seacoast. You probably have to take secondary roads, which wagons break down. When they break down, they cost more. All of these things factor into the overall cost. So by doing, destroying just what was out here by Johnson, what a devastating impact, right? So now instead of 30 or 40 miles overland, and wheat from here, by the way, was kept in Peekskill, so it was gathered there, which is in the Highlands area, and then it was distributed from there. So instead of 30, 40 miles to Albany, let's say, then you can get it on a sloop or something and bring it down, so it's a little bit cheaper. But now, coming up, maybe you can get some of it on the water, but think about the overland route over 200 miles. Now you gotta multiply what it costs. Devastating, devastating. Yep.
Did Lunenburg Turnpike play a role in that?
Now, that wasn't even started until about 1801 or 1802.
And that was a route to Athens, yes, no?
Yeah, eventually.
Eventually.
This is after the Revolution.
Okay.
Yeah, if you want to talk about the development here with grain and livestock and such, yes, that did play a role in how
Eventually.
the economy went, yeah. Yeah, more livestock than people on the road, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anything else? Yep.
Could you just touch on the renters? I wanted to ask, someone mentioned Greensburg was rented, but what's the valley renters?
Was what?
Where the farmers?
Oh, renters?
Renters, yeah.
Renters in certain areas, especially the older Dutch patroon areas like Livingston Manor and Rensselaer Manor, they had a lot of renters, okay? They were brought in specifically to rent those areas that you have terms like we talked about. But out here, you had some, you're gonna have some everywhere because, young people, maybe they didn't have parents who were well off or something. They're gonna rent and they're gonna think that they can eventually have their own place. Renting was legalized slavery, by the way, just so you know. There was a rebellion against that in 1766, prior to the Revolution, in the same area as Ken was talking about, with Livingston Manor and others. There's a rebellion, renters against the landlords. So renting that way in the old Dutch patroonship was very common. Out here, not so much. By the time of the Revolution, per capita, there were more people who owned land that didn't. And you can see that in tax rolls and assessments, because just about everybody was taxed. If you're a renter, different story. Different story.
Here.
Here.
Thank you.
Can't tell you that anywhere else. Probably Mohawk is similar. Yep. Eventually, the Palatines who couldn't buy land were able to buy land, and they bought up a lot of it. Any other questions?
Lots of,
What's that?
I have lots, but
It's okay. Yep.
Do you know where the meat came from?
Where the what?
Meat?
The meat came from?
Yeah, you said they have.
Oh, yeah. Cattle was, the New England states, their big thing was cattle, beef.
Massachusetts?
That came from there. There was, I forget where, other states also. So, yeah, I would love to have a conversation about all these things, but all of them actually were affected by the transportation, right? Because if you have beef that can walk, you have to have the forage for it. That's why short forage almost everybody provided, because the Army went with animals. Animals are a huge part of what the Revolution was all about, whether it's a horse or a oxen or cattle. But if you couldn't get cattle, then it would be pork. So just imagine all these pigs, an army of pigs following an army. It's amazing when you get into the logistics of things. It's just amazing. Any other questions? No? Does anybody have a torch or a pitchfork that you're gonna come after me when I leave this place? I knew you would.
Can I make a comment on that?
Yeah.
I'm 63 years old. I lived in Grand Gorge. I lived in Rhinebeck during my high school years, and I've been, I built 2 houses in this county, and I've been an owner here for 40 years. Breadbasket before.
Yep.
And I've also stood on top of Roman's Nose and had a look at the valley.
Mhm.
And I drove from Middleburg to Schoharie. And I put that into my head, the mileage and the width of the valley.
Mhm.
And I'm like, there's no way that that can be considered an area big enough to grow, especially when Pennsylvania was already cultivated. But in my mind, I've always thought just what you just
Mhm.
described.
Yeah, but that's, you know, I mean, you still call it Breadbasket the Revolution. I might
We will, don't worry.
That's fine. But that's fine, but in reality, it was the strategic breadbasket was a part of it. Yes.
Growing up in this area and living on a dairy farm, I remember when all the farms had a cash crop of wheat.
Yep.
But I also remember when it didn't pay the farmers to have wheat,
Yeah.
and they went strictly to corn.
Yeah.
So I also think mid-70s to mid-80s, that false, I don't know, statement maybe was because as people drove through Schoharie Valley, they saw the wheat fields and just went, oh, okay, we get it.
Maybe, but that, remember, it's in the popular culture what's printed, not, you know, local, yeah, it kind of makes sense, right?
Posting in 79 or
Yeah.
80.
Yep. Yeah, it's a shame that wheat isn't growing, but unfortunately, economically, it's just not there for
No.
people living here. You gotta have much higher crop yields and transportation, it's always about transportation, you know. Any other questions? Oh? So you're all gonna go out there and say it was, you know, a part of the strategic breadbasket of revolution, right? Doesn't quite roll off the tongue as well, right? All right, well, thank you.